Ash is a writer at Palladium magazine, and Palladium is a nonpartisan publication that explores the future of liberalism, governance, and society through responsible, slow publishing and long form analysis. So as Alex was saying, he's going to be talking about COVID-19 and forking the Asian model here in the West. I'll hand it over to you, Ash.
Yeah, thanks, Sebastian. And I'm also managing editor at Palladium magazine, so just disclosing my involvement there. So the Asian model, COVID-19, and some of the geopolitical fallout. Basically, what I'm looking to do in this talk is look at this concept of the Asian model, which is something that has been discussed widely in media, Western discourse, etc. Especially during COVID-19, people have been looking at the response of countries like Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, obviously also the response in China, and it's being compared to the response of a number of the major Western states. We're seeing pluses and or benefits, and we're seeing negative effects of this model. China hid information. It failed to react very quickly. On the other hand, in places like Singapore and Taiwan, the same model was able to respond more effectively. So what I'm going to do in this talk is essentially define the model, look at how this current crisis is starting to create forks in what we sometimes talk about as a very hegemonic model, and some of the lessons we can learn, and perhaps some bold posits about the future. And I will try to convince you, the people listening to this, that in fact, these concepts like geopolitics, like hard and industrial power, matter maybe more than they have in a long time. They can't be routed around very easily. So to begin with, what is the Asian model? When we discuss that term, what we're usually looking at is a number of East Asian states. We're looking at China, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan to a degree. We're seeing developments toward this concept in countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. But what is it? Essentially, on the one hand, we have these countries beginning to look, or having looked in some cases for some time now, like Western countries in terms of their industrial advancement, their material expertise, their level of technology, their standard of living. On the other hand, a lot of these countries have political systems that we would consider more authoritarian, more collective, less free in the way that we think about the concept in the West, less room for individual liberty. And so in that way, this model seems like something distinctive. What does seem to be the case in all of this, though, is that the familiar Western liberal democratic system no longer has a monopoly on economic prosperity. And why is that important? Well, in the Cold War, material prosperity was one of the big advantages that the US had over the Soviet Union, and that the Western Bloc had over the Soviet alliance sphere. It's pretty common to talk about things like freedom or democracy as being the key concepts that won over dissidents or people who left that sphere. And that's true to a degree, but I think that it's often overlooked the degree to which pure economic opportunity motivates things like people leaving their country, sometimes at great risk. If economic prosperity is no longer a monopoly of the Western model, that's going to have big consequences for its legitimacy and how it can promote itself abroad. Now, the Asian model is interesting because it actually can fall on both sides of Western alignment. And this is why it's generally been not an ideological deal breaker for the US or its allies. On the one hand, you have China, obviously now at a more strained relationship with the West than ever before. But through the 90s and 2000s, the West was very dovish toward China. Nevertheless, that's clearly a pull in the geopolitical sense that is not Western. It's not Western aligned, it's independent and sovereign. It's making decisions without regard and sometimes adversarially toward the West. Still, it has industrial development, it has had an increasing standard of living, but it has a party state political system that is not free in the Western sense of that term. On the other hand, though, we have states like South Korea and Singapore. Both of those states are Western aligned. Park Chung-hee's regime in South Korea was not a democratic regime. It was highly authoritarian. It was coercive in the private economy. businessmen were hauled in front of his industrial committees. But that same economic program created the advanced economy we see today, and made South Korea into an important economic power. South Korea, despite having had that regime that's problematic in an ideological sense, is a Western aligned country. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore is another example, and he was really the one who created this concept of an Asian model. In Singapore, he used a mix of protectionist and market measures and increasingly moved to a market system as Singapore developed in order to make a prosperous country that he thought could stand on its own 2 feet, and it has. Despite being a neighbor with Malaysia, there's never really been risk of reabsorption. Likewise, it's managed to remain on fairly good terms with its Chinese neighbor. Singapore is more or less Western aligned, but it also has a more authoritarian political system than the West would really permit, despite having a larger degree of economic freedom. So what's going on here? What is the purpose of calling this an Asian model? Well, there's a few reasons this might be. Maybe it's less threatening in some ways. If you're Singapore or South Korea and you're the leader, you're the government, and you see the need for more authoritarian measures, but you also want to keep the West backing you, maybe you say, well, of course we're a liberal democracy, but with Asian characteristics, with particular differences that are necessary for our local situation, but we don't need to pay too much attention to those. It then allows you to remain a US ally. In the Chinese case, as we'll see in a little bit, it also actually allowed them to do something more, to create a model of government which they see as distinctive from the Western one, and one which they are in fact promoting in various parts of the world. So the Asian model might be something like a convergence rather than, a single thing that's been developed by a lot of different players. They're learning from each other. Deng Xiaoping in China learned from Lee Kuan Yew. People have learned from South Korea. Vietnam is now learning from the Chinese model. And so there's continual development and exchange going on in the creation of this thing. What is happening now? Why am I talking about forks in the Asian model? Essentially, this is what brings us to the question of decentralization, which has been talked about a lot during this conference. And I'm going to focus here on China and Taiwan specifically. And the reason is that, and basically a lot of the arguments I'm going to make here, I originally made in a piece at Palladium magazine called "Only the State Can Succeed at Decentralization." Why am I making this bold claim? We'll see momentarily. When we've looked at the response to COVID-19, I would put to this audience that China and Taiwan can be sort of thought of as the two ends of a spectrum of response when it comes to top-down central coordination versus a more decentralized form of coordination. On the other hand, both China and Taiwan have strong central governments, although ones with different political cultures, and they have increasingly well-developed local institutions, especially on the economic end. So let's look at China first here. What I'm basically going to do here is go through these two models and argue then that we're going to be seeing a fork in what we used to talk about as a Central Asian model, or as a centralized, unified Asian model, rather. China has had decentralization, in fact, since the 80s. It's been in a lot of ways responsible for their economic development. What is the form of China's decentralization? China's decentralization is top-down. It is controlled carefully by the party state, by the Chinese Communist Party and its central committee. It's also something that is obsessively undergirded with theory. I think that when we look at China, something that has been missed in the West is the degree to which they're obsessed with theory and prediction and analysis of their own actions. Had people looked at what the party itself was saying about its economic policies, I think we would have been far less surprised now when China did not end up becoming, more politically liberal as it became economically richer, which was the prediction that a lot of people had made. So, because China privileges political centralization, its decentralization has been mainly economic and material. We're seeing special economic zones, of which Shenzhen is the biggest example. Some of those institutions were adapted from what they studied in places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau. And these special economic zones allow for extensive economic local action. You have foreign investment, you have markets, you have people creating businesses, you have experimentation, you have different regulations as well. In certain regions like Hong Kong and Macau, you have different legal systems as well, which the Chinese party state has more or less integrated into its one country, two systems model. And, theoretically, you could have iterations of this. Vincent Garten wrote for us in Palladium about Zhang Shigong, who is one of the premier Chinese thinkers working on this concept within the party state. He proposed something called one country N systems, a system where you can have many different jurisdictions occurring on a local level with their sovereignty still vested in the party state and preferentially promoted according to the interests of the party state. So political centralization, economic decentralization to a degree, because the state sector in China is still quite strong. And if you look at the bolts and nuts, so to speak, of the Chinese economic system, one quickly realizes how much of that wealth is used to support the public economic structure. And, why does the party do this? Well, the party has always been terrified of destabilization. They have memories of the Cultural Revolution, which was a form of domestic destabilization. They've also obviously always feared foreign destabilization as well. So the resulting culture here is one that wants dynamism in the economic sense, but important decisions at least are something that they control. And if anyone has worked in China, it's a pretty common observation is how hard it is to find information about anything in China. Who's in charge, what are institutions really up to? If you have a lack of information like that, it's fairly reasonable that you're going to see a suspicion of local action, especially in a country where the political system is so based on very low trust relationships within the government. China is also promoting this model around the world. So we have at Palladium covered a number of these projects, the Belt and Road Project, which is the prominent Chinese brand for a number of development programs and trade deals that it's made with countries around the world to varying effects. You have Chinese involvement occurring in Africa as well. Rwanda, Nigeria, Ethiopia are pretty prominent there. Chinese developmental involvement is one form of this, but in places like Lagos, there are even Chinese-backed special economic zones, essentially. And so we're seeing both political and economic influence there. I also want to recommend a recent testimony by Daniel Tobin, who is a member of the National Intelligence University. He gave testimony to the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission on a number of the initiatives China has taken to promote its model around the world. So if you want to go down to the rabbit hole, there's a good resource. Let's flip now to Taiwan. Obviously, the strained relationship there, we saw the World Health Organization being pretty averse to even mentioning it as a distinct entity. But geopolitically, there is a government in Taipei which considers itself independent. And I think even the very bullishly pro-China factions can't really get around that fact. Taiwan's model is distinctive. So rather than a party state, which Taiwan doesn't have, Taiwan's political institutions are more open. They're more familiarly Western in that sense. And in fact, one of the big transformations that happened in Taiwan in the last few years, in the 2010s, was something called the Sunflower Movement, which was a Taiwanese movement that was suspicious that the Taiwanese government was essentially becoming too close to China in trade deals that it was undergoing and so on. Through the course of the Sunflower Movement, you had the rise of a programmer and hacker community called GovZero. So G0V is the moniker they use. Basically, to make a very long story short, in the course of that movement, a number of programmers entered the Taiwanese government, and the Taiwanese state ended up having a systemic upgrade in their technological competency. Audrey Tang, who is the digital minister in Taiwan, has spurred a lot of this. And Taiwan has basically developed a fairly fleshed out model now of digital governance, which is very distinct. It is still centralized in certain ways. So when the COVID response began, the Taiwanese government accessed things like migration data, insurance data, etc., to inform its decisions. On the other hand, it's left a lot more room for social action on the ground. So the GovZero community created a number of apps, for example. One of those apps tracked mask availability at various hospitals to make sure that they could trade with each other, that people could go to hospitals where there was a larger supply to make sure shortages didn't happen. Basically, a number of these initiatives taken by civil society in collaboration with the Taiwanese government were extremely important, and it was part of the strategy employed in Taiwan in its COVID response. You still have also an openness of data. And this is something that I think is distinctive from a lot of the discourses in the West, including in Europe, where openness of data is part of the equation here. However, there is greater regulatory room in Taiwan for voluntarily disclosing this data, for having ownership of it once it's disclosed. And obviously, in a country where you have higher political trust in general, you're going to have people more willing to disclose data and more willing to collaborate on the platforms that that disclosure allows. And so even before the current pandemic happened, Taiwan had experimented with things like digital platforms for having citizens respond on policy questions. And some of these platforms are, for example, the Polis platform, which hosts things like the V-Taiwan program. Basically, what these programs do is when a policy question arises, citizens participate in them and can, through answering questions, through voting on positions, come around Schelling points, essentially. And the Taiwanese government can use these Schelling points to inform the policy decisions that they make. So a number of these experiments have gone on in Taiwan. It's its own rabbit hole that one can go down. But essentially, what's the result? Taiwan's digital model and its governing model in general is based on higher trust in the population, on more room for voluntary and local action that's also social and political and not only economic. And there is an emphasis on inclusivity in terms of its technological strategies. So those are the differences in the Chinese and the Taiwanese model. Other countries that we've mentioned, South Korea, Singapore, can be thought of as falling on something of a spectrum here. Singapore has a lot more centralized action. South Korea does as well, but South Korea also has extremely strong privacy laws. And so the reason I think it's useful to use Taiwan and China as ends of a spectrum is because it lets us see the array of policies that exist among these East Asian states. And this will bring us to the argument that there is a fork going on here. Geopolitically, that's driven by the fact that as the American-Chinese relationship becomes more strained, it's likely that we will see a greater willingness to back governments like those in Taiwan, those in South Korea, as a way to counterbalance Chinese power. And to the degree that people have been looking at the East Asian model as being more effective in things like delivering state capacity, in responsiveness, and so on, uh, it will be useful but also beneficial to have local adaptations of that model such that the superpower, China, doesn't have a monopoly on what an Asian model looks like. And so, for a number of these reasons, I think that we're going to see forks. Political reasons, because states have an incentive to distinguish themselves, particularly from China. On the Chinese side, it has an incentive to distinguish its model from that of more Western friendly ones. But also because, in concrete terms, there are real differences here. There are differences in technological policy, in material results, in the way that citizens interact with these systems. There are also similarities, though, and I think that those similarities are going to bring us to some interesting questions. First of all, decentralization in both cases is coming from the center rather than against the center. What do I mean by this? While the party state is very top down and centralized, and Taiwan is more open, inclusive, and perhaps trusting, in both cases, the forms of governance being used are being used to inform centralized action, to make sure that states and governments can act more effectively and quickly in the response, and more generally in the policies being used here. When we're seeing other countries being influenced by these models, it's governments who are being influenced by them. We have Saudi Arabia, for example, which had been working on a special economic zone, essentially something like a charter city called Neom. We've seen, as I mentioned earlier, Lagos looking at how to use special economic zones. We're seeing political power actors using decentralization to strengthen themselves. And I think that's an interesting development, and one that's not discussed enough. In Palladium, one of the first pieces I wrote, this is about a year and a half ago now, was on charter cities. And if people have been involved in this, they probably know that charter cities kind of come out of a very libertarian ethos. The idea is that cities will be built that can finally route around, sclerotic, bureaucratic central power. But interestingly, the special economic zones and charter city type arrangements that we've seen successfully done around the world are not done against central power actors. They're done by them to route around often sclerotic middlemen agencies. For example, the Chinese special economic systems or special economic zones were set up in part to route around the mid-level bureaucratic agencies that Deng Xiaoping and his faction saw as obstructive and untrustworthy. So decentralization then starts looking very different from what we've assumed. And in both cases, in both of these forms of the Asian model, I think we are going to continue to see decentralization from the center. I also think the distinction between these two systems is not really individual versus collective. Insofar as we want to talk about a common Asian model, I think it's based more on the fact politically that distinction is seen as a sort of false binary, a false dichotomy. It's something more like cooperative versus directed models. The Taiwanese model, I think, sees itself as creating systems that allow cooperation to occur. But this action is still taken from the center. Maybe the equivalent, the simile here might be like establishing something like transportation systems. There are obviously winners and losers from a transportation system, but the aim of them is essentially to allow other people to do things. The China model is far more top-down, and this would be more akin to things like publicly owned industries, where strategy is coming from the center. And that distinction allows for both individual and collective action, but in different forms. I think it basically disprivileges the dichotomy of individual versus collective, because what is being built here is something more like a feedback loop. In the Taiwanese case, that feedback loop is between central and local action on all spectrums, social, political, economic, and so on. In the China model, it's more economic, but perhaps also increasingly geopolitical. You're seeing Chinese involvement now in places like Serbia. We've seen it obviously for a long time in some of the Latin American countries like Venezuela. But with 5G, we're going to see it increasingly in countries that were considered reliably Western aligned. Palladium magazine has covered the 5G question in the past. And one of the best explanations I've seen for things like the sanctions that were being placed when 5G was being discussed was because American diplomatic efforts were not successful in particularly on continental Europe in convincing those governments to not cooperate with the Chinese. Once the sanctions were in place, we saw Korean companies, for example, Japanese companies start to get deals more easily. What are the implications for elsewhere? I think that we will see countries still looking at the Chinese model, but as that relationship sours in certain places because of debt or because of just an overreach on the Chinese part, it may be the case that, especially if there is Western backing, forms like the Taiwanese model or the Korean or the Singaporean model might gain more attention, especially as a way to distinguish countries from China or even stop them coming totally under Chinese political influence. Palladium has covered Rwanda, for example, where the government there has drawn some inspiration from this model in recent years. I want to look at America as well for a moment, because in American discourse, there's a lot of attention being given now to the lessons that can be learned from the East Asia model. I don't think that either model can be simply replicated into America. I think that's kind of a dumb assumption or question. However, I think that America and Americans need to be open to learning lessons. You know, the Soviet Union fell because it was not able to update its institutions, its politics, and its culture forbade it from learning lessons, because essentially it was already supposed to have the best system in the world. If America falls into that same mental trap, then it will start inevitably to undergo the same sclerosis and decline as the Soviet Union. However, America is neither China nor Taiwan. I don't think that a high trust model that is operating on an island with a unitary state works in a country that is highly diverse, is geographically and demographically huge, and has a different history. The China model obviously also does not fit into American or broadly Western culture, which does privilege individual liberty and action. But as those terms have kind of been continually evolved, we could say, you know, what does individual liberty look like when you're living on a farm in an American territory in the 19th century versus what it looks like living in New York in 2020 after this crisis probably looks somewhat different, even though they come from the same cultural root. What America needs to do, I think, is look at why the systems work where they work. And I think that the decentralization question is very important here. And so I'm going to kind of end on this concept. Decentralization in both cases here has the goal of creating positive feedback loops between central and local actors. This, I think, is something that's common to both the Chinese and the Taiwanese branch of the Asian model. I think in the discourse here, decentralization is often seen as adversarial, right? You're trying to fracture or break from some kind of central actor. I think that this kind of ignores how decentralization often really occurs. You know, even in the early industrial period, modern markets were being promoted by states, the British Empire, French Empire, for political reasons. I think that if we're going to empirically think about where decentralization is headed, we're going to have to consider which power actors are driving them and for what reasons, and what are the resulting systems going to look like. I think also that there are discourses now in America which are themselves starting to do this. So state capacity and industrial policy are concepts which have returned to American political life. This refers to the concept that state action can actually create value and drive development. More specifically, that it can actually drive decentralized action as well. In fact, this is part and parcel of an American tradition, the American system or the American school, built in the 19th century and which lasted until the early 20th century, which used a mix of central actions such as tariffs to protect local industry, but then also had a lot of room for private companies, for regional and state governments to take action. Basically, decentralization and central action were seen here as two tools which could be used for the goal of developing a country. Essentially, rather than seeing either of these as an end in itself, there was a higher order goal, which was national development, and both had to be used in a strong way in order to reach that goal. And it's interesting that when we talk about an Asian model, that same logic has now been replicated and is seen as something new and untried, when in fact it's been this deep part of American history as well. I think that finally we're also going to have to take the states doing this seriously. The big mistake that we made, I think in the 80s and 90s, was assuming that when China in particular talked about having not state capitalism, but socialist markets, when it talked about the fact that the markets were meant to serve the party state, we more or less dismissed this as kind of, oh, this is just ideological dress. It's just for legitimacy. We all know that they're going to become a democracy at some point. In fact, if people had listened and read and engaged with this is obviously not to say that it's always honest. This is not the case. But if people had taken seriously that decision makers in China had different goals, I think we would have been much more quick to predict the direction of their development. Going forward, I think that we're going to want to do this not only with China, but also with governments who are creating their own forks of the Asian model. So they are, in the end, real alternative models. I don't think that we're just seeing local adaptations that are going to be absorbed into the Western mode. Decentralization in this case is going to look very different from what we thought in many cases. But I think that if we look at how it's successful, people here who are interested in decentralization can maybe start to create forks of the American model as well. And I think this is a conversation for another time, but that leads us to some very interesting places. So I think I'll end there, and perhaps you can open this up to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ash. That was a fascinating talk. And I think it just kind of flows pretty perfectly with the rest of the content that we've covered today, which was fairly focused on long-term trends, politics and economics. It just fits so perfectly. So I'm glad that you could join us.
I'm very glad. Thanks again for the invite.
While you were, so we'll open up the questions. If you have any questions, please leave them in the Q&A, and we'll be fielding questions and giving the opportunity for people to speak. Just raise your hand if you'd like to pose your question on the air. So, I mean, one of the things that we were talking about earlier today is how the COVID crisis potentially puts us on a trend towards more local consumption, more local production, less of a dependency on sort of foreign production and supply chains, etc. If we are on this trend of more local economies, etc., where presumably the dependence on China, like for example here in France, most of our healthcare production for things like ventilators, masks, etc., is coming from China. If we're on this trend where dependence on China is reduced, then how does that affect basically your proposal here that China is growing in influence? Would that potentially reduce China's influence generally?
Yeah, I think the big question here, right, is like, will we actually end up doing this? We've already seen over the last really decade or more that a lot of Western governments seem to not be able to carry out long-term strategies in the way that perhaps they once did. Once the crisis is over and once the media and the political discourse flips to the next issue the way it always does, will we actually have the political clout and like willpower to implement the sort of changes, to relocalize entire supply chains is an extremely huge order. When South Korea did this, when it created domestic supply chains, it was done by the state being the first buyer for strategic industries that were domestic. It was a 10, 20, sometimes 30-year process, depending on the industry, to build up that economy. And this was done by a government that was fairly unified and under extreme geopolitical pressure. Are Western governments going to have that kind of willpower? I guess we're going to see. Speaking personally, I hope that some do. I mean, it's very clear that there is a lot of dependency here. But what will China do as a result? If we end up doing this, I think that its influence will diminish in certain areas. I think that a number of countries are going to start trying to diversify away from China anyway. Palladium's covered Kazakhstan, for example, which is a quite rapidly developing country that's often overlooked. And it has embraced a model where it tries to kind of counterbalance America, China, Turkey, and Russia against each other and become more of a crossroads country rather than just, a vassal state of one power. So we might see some countries trying to diversify in that way. I think that if America starts updating its conceptual model of governance, it's probably best incentivized to frame or to conceive of that as the return of an older American tradition. And I mentioned here the American system, because this kind of undermines the Chinese line that its model is sort of distinctive. China cares a lot that countries which see its model as successful see it as inherent to Chinese socialism, which they still hold as their guiding principle. Perhaps someone will have a question on this, but I essentially do take the view that China runs on a Marxist conception of power. I don't think that it is, state capitalist. I don't think that it's kind of, people will talk about capitalism with Confucian characteristics or something like this. What we have is a party state with a Marxist conception of power that uses markets in a way that is consistent with its interpretation of that ideology. So if America can break that monopoly on the idea of, a more dynamic form of central action, then maybe this will countervail Chinese ideological influence as well.
Okay, I understand. And when you talk about the fall of the Soviet Union, and because it failed to upgrade its governance system and its political system, and the risk that the U.S. or the West more generally perhaps faces in also having this similar fate if it doesn't upgrade its system in a sense. What do Western states effectively need to do, or what is the direction that we need to take in order to avoid falling to too much influence from China and generally Asia?
So yeah, I discussed this a little more in my original article at Palladium, but essentially, and I'll focus on America here. I think it seems to be quite clear that at the federal level, what you really have is not a unified federal actor. You have a number of different factions. You have regulatory bodies and elected bodies. They have distinct interests from each other. And it's actually quite difficult to implement strategy on a national level. the result, I've always been suspicious of the notion that you would ever see things like, it's fashionable to talk about maybe states seceding or American Civil War. I actually don't think that the demographic prerequisites for something like that exist, at least not in the near future. But it can certainly be the case that you have like zombification occur from the top down. So we saw this happen to an extent with the FDA. When emergency procedures were put in place, the FDA's regulatory system actually slowed down things like approval of tests and the like. And obviously, this is impeding both central and local action, right? Federal response is impeded by a body that kind of is not directly controlled in an effective way. It's not directed in an effective way. And local action, companies manufacturing tests, maybe in some case state and local governments that wanted to coordinate that sort of thing are now impeded by a regulatory body at the federal level. This is sort of what I hinted at in the Chinese case when I talked about how part of the impetus, I think, behind Deng implementing the special economic zones was circumventing what he saw as corrupt or disloyal middleman factions. I think that what America will ultimately have to do is find ways to both centralize coordination at the federal level. So what I mean by that is like the authority and ability to create strategy. I think a case of this being done well in the COVID response was actually the COVID-19 open database that I believe the White House was behind that initiative. And, they made available not only public and private data, but even pre-publication data so that local industries could benefit from it. But you're having this on the one hand, and then you have FDA obstruction on the other. This is a federal system that doesn't have good coordination. I think it needs to improve that coordination. On the other hand, making it easier for local action to occur, like medical institutions in different states being able to trade information with each other, which is an obstacle right now. This would unleash the ability for competent local actors to respond to federal strategy. And that's what I kind of mean by both the center and local action being simultaneously strengthened in a sort of positive feedback loop. I think that's the key logic that's being applied here.
Okay. Do we have any questions for Ash? So there's one question here, which is somewhat related, I think, to my question, but is, what can we do to prevent our democracy in the U.S., generally in the West, to turn to full authoritarianism? And I think this kind of broadly more relates to the current crisis. And yesterday we talked a lot about privacy and the risks to civil liberties that this crisis poses. So, what are your thoughts on authoritarianism from this respect?
So I think we kind of have to think about what, and I'm going to take a very basic definition of authoritarianism here as, power grabs and running roughshod over personal freedoms and law and the like. What causes that to happen? I think we often assume that kind of power begets power. If you had a federal government, a Congress or a White House with authority to take fairly decisive action, this would kind of inevitably slide into authoritarianism or dictatorial power and so on. But there's ways in which it can occur, but I think what's often overlooked is the way that actually division and factionalism and perceived threats are actually what spur those kinds of moves. So, looking in the Chinese context, the Cultural Revolution didn't happen because Mao had, a firm hold over China. It happened because Mao was surrounded, as far as he was concerned, by enemies. He thought that, at any point he might be overthrown. He saw ideological dissent, and he decided to launched the Cultural Revolution as a way to destroy those enemies. Likewise, let's take another example. South Korea, under the Park regime, which was an authoritarian regime, existed and was allowed to exist by the US because of the communist threat from North Korea and from China. I think that the way that we circumvent or maybe that we guard against that possibility is by building institutions that are effective and that are also secure. So let me give an example here. I mentioned that Taiwan has experimented with a number of digital platforms that allow citizens to participate in how decisions are come to and how policies are carried out. Well, I don't really see the federal U.S. government doing that, or even most states, but perhaps cities can start to experiment with technologies like this. Why can't San Francisco or New York start to upgrade with technology how those decisions are made, so that when central action occurs, it's informed by the people living in those places who are impacted by those decisions? And this is one example. I think that in some ways this is already obviously meant to be the ideal, but we've seen that the way that a lot of times elections usually work is that some or another political machine is put in power. And maybe the US is right now, it doesn't have the political ability or culture to do that on a large scale. So I think we have to identify the institutions that have the possibility to act, and then think about, okay, how can we allow the central action to occur in a way that doesn't lead to more chaos and factionalism, which I would argue is what spurs the authoritarian response.
So do we have any other questions for Ash in the Q&A? Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions.
I had a thorough talk then.
It was pretty thorough. So tell us a bit about Palladium.
Sure. So Palladium is based in San Francisco. It's a magazine that covers issues of technology, of geopolitics, of development, and essentially some of the stuff I talked about today. What is the future of governance? What kinds of governance models are going to come out of this crisis, and what models are being developed right now? That's the question that we're interested in. And so, we've done a lot of on the ground work, I'm glad to say. We're less than a couple years old. We've already had stories come out of Venezuela, out of the Balkans, various regions of China, Kazakhstan. We are present at Davos in 2019. And so I think we have a strong focus on actually looking at what's going on in order to inform our analysis. There's a lot of purely theoretical writing that goes on, and we kind of try to avoid that. I think that also on the decentralization question, some of the concepts I talked about here are stuff that we're going to try to develop. And so I encourage people to follow some of that analysis. I think it's going to be useful for people working in the crypto space, but also, governance policy and the like.
Yeah, I mean, we've had obviously like several people here in this conference that are coming from the crypto space. Not as much as we would have typically, because I mean, I do run a crypto podcast. It's been a pretty diverse and it's an interdisciplinary group of speakers. I mean, coming from the crypto side, I think like a lot of the conversations right now are around government-backed central bank-backed digital currencies. Things like DeFi and bringing people into new financial ecosystems. Obviously, Bitcoin has a big role to play as well as in this narrative of being the new reserve currency or like a safe haven currency or something like that. I think that perhaps out of all of these sort of different narratives, the Bitcoin as some form of, you know, trusted store of value asset that is a sort of antidote to, you know, central bank bailouts is probably the one that is most likely to prevail. A lot of the stuff that's happening in DeFi and that ecosystem, and I don't know if Alex is still with us, but Alex is pretty deeply in this, pretty deep in this ecosystem. I don't see a lot of that having a lot of influence outside of that ecosystem, outside of that community. I think it's will stay relatively contained. And then the central bank backed digital currencies, I tend to think, and actually Jim Bianco, our next speaker, I tend to follow his point of view, because we've talked about this, and that is that there will be stable digital currencies that operate at a scale that are much larger than Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency, but they won't be backed by central banks. And it's more likely, and I don't know if Libra is what's coming, but
we've actually covered Libra as well at Palladium.
Sorry?
We've actually covered Libra as well at Palladium and kind of the possibilities of that. I think that, you know, in all these cases, I know that central banks are a major issue that people in the crypto space look at. I think, and you know, that's quite valuable. I think that what is sometimes overlooked here and, you know, this is both public finance and central banks.
Sorry, I think we lost you for about 10 seconds. You said what sometimes overlooked is?
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. When you have an economy that's primarily focused on the financial aspect, so, you know, when you have the banking system in the US as powerful as it is, you even have things like debt being sold in companies like GE and Ford, which are supposed to produce, you know, real manufacture items. You're gonna start ignoring, as an economy and probably as a political system, real production. And so I think that the question earlier about you know, having supply chains become local again is pretty important there. You know, crypto has a lot of interesting applications when it comes to things like exposing the problems of, say, fiat or central banking systems. And there's a lot of interesting discussions that can go on there. But when a single rival superpower controls all your medical devices, when it controls a lot of the day-to-day items that you use, you know, one cannot kind of purely survive on, I think, local economies or on forking new currencies. I think that inevitably you come back to what are we actually making? And to me, questions of finance or of currency should be more about how does this make things like liquidity available for producing those things.
Alex, did you have anything you want to bring up? I know you're back. You just came back, right?
Hey, yeah, I didn't have the chance to fully hear your talk, but that was nice that you touched on crypto. So yeah, I'm
not just talking about how DeFi wasn't going to grow to anything very significant.
Oh, really? Oh, well, I can discuss this. I think I have a prediction actually that I'm risking my skin in the game on is I think we'll see a central bank digital currency be released this year. And the fact that it will be in a permission blockchain or a private blockchain or a public blockchain doesn't really matter because we can build kind of interoperable bridges between them. And I think that's a huge growth relay for DeFi. And so the new financial products that the community in Ethereum especially has been building, and it's a better system. It's more transparent. It's actually backed usually by ETH or by Bitcoin instead of unlimited money printing by the Fed. And so there are great rates like Compound where you can basically have savings account with a 10 times better yield And so I think these innovations really will be huge. And I think if
Do you
crypto,
have a prediction on which governments might be the first movers?
well, I would say China, I think, issued a paper on the fact that they are planning to release their own stable coin, so digital currency. And
Right, the DCEP, I think it's called.
right. And what's really interesting is that, sure, China within its borders can do pretty much whatever they want with the parameters of that currency. But outside, for international payments, they are settling on Ethereum, which is really fascinating because then that allows the whole DeFi space, all the products being built right now to be leveraged. So that's really interesting.
Interesting. I think that part of the talk was about political culture and like higher versus lower trust political cultures, and in particular the fact that Taiwan probably has among the higher trust ones in the Asian model, whereas China obviously has one of the lower trust ones. I think it'll be interesting to see what moves Taiwan continues to make into that space. I don't actually think Taiwan early on was very open to crypto. I think it shared kind of the same suspicion as a lot of governments did. But given that there are so many programmers working in the Taiwanese government, and that like these inclusive and decentralized platforms are already being used there, it'll be interesting to see. I think obviously the flip side of that is that Taiwan is a fairly small country, and is being locked out of influence by a lot of international actors.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Like countries with decent, great systems like Taiwan that you probably know more than me on, or Singapore. Yeah, if you have a really healthy system that works well, although because they are on a smaller scale, yeah, perhaps crypto value proposition is not as attractive. And so maybe adoption will be slower. So yeah, I get this point.
I'm interested to hear if you think that geopolitical power matters if a state is rolling out crypto. Like, if you're a superpower and you roll out a cryptocurrency, or like a stable coin or anything, is that going to make you more effective at getting people using it? Because Venezuela's attempt failed for obvious reasons.
Venezuela attempt failed. You mean like they tried to issue a stablecoin?
Venezuela, I can double check this. We actually did some writing about this when the protests in Venezuela were happening at Palladium. But I believe Venezuela had tried to get into the crypto space because their own currency was essentially useless.
You're talking about the Petro.
The Petro, yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
Oh.
I mean, and in that case, like a country that didn't have influence or clout or wealth was not able to get anyone to use their currency.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Petro was more of I'd want to say like a PR stunt than anything else, and I think there's been quite a bit of coverage around this. That, well, you know.
So I mean, was it live? Was it issued? How was it distributed?
Yeah,
I would have to. I'm not super familiar on the details of how its experiment was done.
But actually, Patrick had a question. Go ahead.
So a little bit off of this topic specifically, but I was just curious to know, like, what you think the repatriation of supply chains to Western countries, what the impact of that might be on how Western countries organize themselves fiscally, and how they're able to draw on their tax base, if that changes the tax base.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we are, like, quite frankly, going to see the end of a fiscal policy focused essentially on keeping the deficits as low as possible. And there's maybe two distinct reasons. So governments that are coming out of more populist style origins obviously have an incentive to build up legitimacy very quickly. But governments, and so I'm in Toronto, and the Liberal Party government here under Justin Trudeau, for the first few years of its first government, basically said that we are going to run deficits and focus essentially on investment. And, you know, after essentially 10 to 15 years, where I think the model of deficits first and austerity in Europe, like, this has delegitimized itself. So, with this added spur now of wanting to bring back supply chains, I think that states are going to start looking at spending more through the investment lens, which maybe makes sense, right? Like if you're just doing QE repeatedly, you're devaluing your own currency. But all you're really doing is supporting a bunch of zombie industries like the banking sector, for example. Whereas if maybe you're willing to spend to actually start building hard industries or rebuilding hard industries, then that is how investment works. Do Western governments have the long-term planning ability to do this? I think that's a different question. I'm a little pessimistic on this, but maybe we'll get surprises.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. I'd be interested if we want to keep the discussion going for a little bit on the crypto end, because this is something that I personally haven't looked at as much when doing this research. I think a lot of the crypto discourse has been around, or routing around government, like official currencies, or around central governments. I'd be interested to hear if people think that if we do see governments getting into this space, whether they're, the legitimacy that maybe this lens will actually be successful or not. I think I've seen Russia had also, had discussion going on about the same topic. I'm not familiar if they're actually doing anything on that front.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a great question. There's a lot of different, I think like having a central bank or like an issuer or some currency involves so much trust. Then even though citizens might dislike governments, it probably is the best source of trust. There's also Libra by Facebook, which is a giant tech company.
Mm-hmm.
So what do people think is most trustworthy? Like a private company who's kind of renowned for not being perfect with privacy, or a government that they might not trust, or maybe like a completely outsider alternative. Like we've seen MakerDAO, which is a company issuing a stablecoin called DAI, which is backed by ETH. So we can say like they almost adopted the Ethereum standard, like a reference to the gold standard. But even then, like they will probably struggle to get as much traction as the distribution that the government of Facebook can get. So it would be really interesting. Sure. I think most consumers perhaps do not care as much if it brings utility to them. And so if it's widely accepted and it's easier to transfer, and maybe governments have some incentives like a tax reduction if you're using those currencies, or I'm not sure what to imagine. But I don't think Facebook has a lot of privacy concerns amongst tech-savvy people, but still usage remains super high, especially in Instagram or WhatsApp. So I don't think that trust in institutions is a huge problem towards the adoption of cryptocurrencies that are government-backed. So that would be my take on it.
Interesting. I wonder if it might not be more useful to basically think of, some of the largest companies in the space as being more similar to states rather than small startups, right? Like the sort of just global geopolitical power that Facebook has, for example. Should we really be comparing this to like some small tech startup, or should we be comparing this to the stuff that countries can do?
Yeah, I would argue for the latter. And I think most of Silicon Valley think they are above governments, especially as like Facebook has more users than any country in the world. This makes sense. And I would argue
I think it's a very good point.
Just look at the situation with Amazon right now in France. Like this is textbook what you're talking about. So in recent weeks in France, Amazon, so the high courts basically said that Amazon could no longer operate their logistic facilities in France because they had not respected social distancing guidelines and had not implemented policies that would protect their employees. And their response to this was basically, well, we're sorry that the French government thinks that we shouldn't operate in France anymore. So, well, you're just going to keep getting all your stuff, and you're still going to be able to receive all the things that you order. Meanwhile, in the background, they're just shipping from Italy or Germany or the UK or anything.
Of course.
Delays are slightly longer, but people are still getting their.
Yeah, I mean, Amazon is particularly interesting because if you look at the actual corporate structure of the company, it seems to be almost ready to be challenged by states. Like its team model and the distinctions between departments are pretty much, as far as I can tell, such that like if the US say went really ham on the antitrust front, Amazon could pretty much split up into a bunch of different companies and then continue operating more or less the same way.
Really? I wasn't aware of that.
Palladium has done some work on this as well, and I think that if we see companies, because Facebook to me seems like a company that has always been really hesitant to think too much like the organization that it actually is. When you see Zuckerberg speak about these issues, Twitter is a little like this as well. Although they're so politically relevant, they really try to, maintain the stance. Well, we're just platforms. We're just, we're providing a service. We're basically companies. Amazon seems to be a little more ambitious. I mean, when you're talking like Jeff Bezos getting into like the human space flight game, in addition to delivering like everything on Earth pretty much, this doesn't seem to be an organization that thinks the way that a normal company does.
Yeah. No, I think this very much reflects this idea that big tech companies are not just big tech companies, but they rival the sovereignty of states in some respect. And we've seen this with Amazon, we've seen this with Facebook, and there will be others, I'm sure. This is really interesting, but